Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Bolkcom. I'm the host of the program. I'm a county supervisor over here in Johnson County, and as I've said before, supervisors and county government provide a variety of important services to people both in rural Iowa and in urban Iowa, and I encourage you to check out what's going on in your county. I think in the future we're going to do a show on county government to try and explain some of the things that are going on around our state. At this time, I'd like to thank and welcome those viewers in the following towns that are going to be seeing Iowa News and Views for the first time, and those are viewers in Dubuque, Burlington, Fort Dodge, and North Liberty. Welcome to all of you viewers. We appreciate you joining us. We now are seen in 14 communities around the state of Iowa, and we're growing stronger all the time. Iowa News and Views is a program about current events and local and state issues. As we've said before, you're not going to see the content anywhere else that we're covering on this show, so we encourage you to continue to tune in. The first topic that we're going to talk about tonight is a current events piece, and it relates to an article that was written in the ICON, the Iowa City Independent Weekly magazine, and it's the 1997 Progressive Index of legislators' voting record in this past legislative session. And there are a number of very interesting findings in this article. You know, Iowa's had 30 years worth of Republican governors, and this last legislative session was the first time in 15 years that both the House of Representatives and the state Senate were in Republican control. And there were a variety of issues that were addressed in this Progressive Index. The writers of this article, Michelle Rubin and Melanie Carrico, who assisted with it, focused on about 9 different bills that were debated in the Iowa legislature this year. And what the Progressive Index indicated was the Iowa legislature is in a fairly conservative mode these days. This focused on progressive issues. The topics included votes on things like abortion restrictions, learned fair, workplace, drug testing, reporting of abortion statistics, legislation dealing with English only as a state language, an inheritance tax bill, income tax bills, and of course the Equal Rights Amendment and a domestic violence checkoff. When the totals were totaled up, we had 4 legislators in our state that scored 100%. That is, they voted the way that a progressive person might vote on 100% of the time. They were 3 women and 1 man. Minette Doder in the House, and Ed Fallon in the House, and Johnny Hammond in the Senate, and Elaine Zamoniak in the Senate. Hammond and Zamoniak are both from Des Moines. We had a couple different pockets of progressivism in Des Moines legislators, Ames legislators, and Johnson County legislators. 64% of the Senate and 51% of the House had scores lower than 19%. And if you were to take away the votes for the Equal Rights Amendment and the domestic violence checkoff, both of which passed unanimously, we would have had 51 members of the House would have actually scored a 0, and 33 members of the Senate would have scored a 0. Most people now think that we should add the women to our Constitution, and there's great support also for having taxpayers put money in a checkoff for domestic violence. At any rate, the legislature is very conservative, and we want to delve into that topic tonight. And joining us right now is State Representative Ed Fallon from Des Moines. Ed is joining us by phone, and it's good to have you with us, Ed.
Good evening.
In talking about this ICON story, we see that the legislature's obviously moved very conservatively. And for you, Ed, you've had a 100% score on this. What does it mean to be a progressive legislator in Iowa right now?
Well, you know, the range of issues covered in the index are really just a handful of the issues that I think are of interest to people concerned about what we might call a progressive agenda. And if you wanted to rate all the issues, there'd be quite a long list of legislation that affects the average person in ways that are. Occasionally, we did some good stuff this year, but overall, the tenor still tends to remain very much pro big business at the expense of small business, at the expense of the average person, working person, and certainly at the expense of low-income people.
Mm-hmm. So being progressive puts you in a position where you're looking at the greater public good, I suspect.
That's my definition. Again, I don't tend to be comfortable with any definition. I think the words liberal and conservative mean so many different things to so many people that they really become rather meaningless. I mean, for example, I consider myself very conservative on fiscal matters. I'm, not in favor of handouts to corporations or to anybody for that matter, unless there's a strong case that it's in the general public good. But progressive, in my mind, means that you are identifying more with the needs of the citizenry as opposed to any particular group of special interests. And the truth is, most special interests are representing some profit-oriented entity, some large business usually. Occasionally groups that I tend to agree with, like labor unions or teachers groups. But for the most part, the majority of entities lobbying for the legislature's attention in the rotunda at the state capitol are representing large industries that don't have the average person's interest in mind. And I take exception to that point of view and have tried to identify myself with those who are generally cut out of the process because of that.
Sure. Ed, is the Iowa legislature reflective of the broader Iowa perspective? Is Iowa as conservative as this legislative index would indicate, do you think?
Well, it depends on the issue. I mean, think about crime. I really do believe that, in large part, because of the media's focus on crime as an easy issue to get a 20-second soundbite on, an easy issue to do a story about, that the general public has a very strong misrepresentation of the reality of crime and also the potential for effective solutions. And I think the truth is the solutions we're currently attempting are not very effective in terms of deterring crime, in terms of providing restitution to victims, and in terms of providing rehabilitation. And in that sense, the General Assembly is in touch with what the public wants, because most of what's been happening in the legislature has been very, very much along the theme that we need to lock people up, throw away the key at all costs.
Right.
And regardless of how it impacts victims or their families or the criminals or society in general. So on that issue, I would say, yeah, the legislature is probably in step with the public.
Okay.
And the public is, in large part because of the media's influence, out of step with where we need to be.
I see.
On a lot of other issues, I think the legislature is indeed far more conservative, if I can use that word again, with the caveat I threw in earlier, far more conservative than the general public.
Right.
For example, take the environment. I think the general public is really adamantly in favor of strong environmental protection laws, and yet, especially at the federal level, but to some extent at the state level too, we have seen efforts to erode environmental protection laws. That is clearly, far more. And again, I hesitate to use the word conservative, but it's the best one that comes to mind. Far more conservative than where the general public is. And I can give you plenty more examples. I think generally speaking that's the case, but there are exceptions like crime, where I think unfortunately the legislature is reflective of where the general public is at.
Sure. Well, I share your concern about the use of labels. I know we throw those around a lot, and indexes like this that combine a lot of information and then kick it out. We end up talking in those kind of terms.
Yeah.
One last question, Ed. What are the prospects, do you believe, for progressive politics in Iowa in the next 2 years?
Well, it depends on how many people really want to get involved in politics. A lot of people don't realize just how seriously politics affects their lives, and I think if and when people become more aware of just how strong the connection is to what goes on in Congress or in the state legislature, how strong that connection is to what goes on in their daily lives, the more people begin to realize that connection, I think the better our prospects are for seeing some change, seeing more movement toward acceptance of a progressive agenda. But that's it's going to take a shedding of some apathy and a willingness to put yourself on the line. Right now, I mean, I've been trying hard to recruit candidates for public office in Polk County, and I tell you, it's like trying to pull teeth. It's
very difficult
not easy going.
thing.
People don't want to do it.
Sure.
A lot of them just don't realize how seriously these processes affect their lives. And I think I have optimism that as those connections become clearer, more and more progressive-minded people will get involved.
Very good. Ed, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you again. We'd love to have you come on the show sometime when it's convenient for you to do that.
I'd like to do that.
Very good.
All right, thank you,
Have
Joe.
a good evening.
Bye.
I'd like to thank Ed Fallon for joining us from Des Moines tonight. If you'd like to get a copy of this article in the icon of the Progressive 1997 Index of the State Legislative Voting Records, you can do that by visiting their web page, and you can read that article at their web page, and we'll give you that on the screen here. Check it out and see what you think. Very good. I'd now like to introduce our next guest on the program this evening. There's been a lot of interest in agricultural issues over the course of the last few years and what's going on in rural Iowa to keep farmers on the farm. And here in Johnson County, the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District has developed a program called the Non-Farmer's Guide to Agriculture, where people in urban settings in Johnson County, Iowa City, Coralville, and like, can get to know what's going on in farms in Johnson County and some of the concerns and issues facing the farm community. And with us tonight is District Commissioner from the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District, Mary Somerville. Pleased to have you here.
Great to be here, Joe.
All counties have Soil and Water Conservation District Commissioners. Mary, you were elected to that position. When did you get elected, and what term are you serving now?
Okay, Joe, you're taking me way back here. I was elected in 1990. At that time, there were 6-year terms. Since then, the legislature has changed them to 4-year terms. So I'm in my second term right now.
Very good. It's good to have you here. The Non-Farmer's Guide to Agriculture brings rural and urban folks together to talk about agriculture. How did this program get started, and when did it begin?
Well, our program started probably around 1992. It was at that time that a lot of the farmers were in the midst of putting together their conservation plans. At that time, the federal farm bill called for any farmer who wanted to take advantage of any government programs had to have a conservation plan in place. So they were working with our staff at the Natural Resources Conservation Service and working on those plans. The other thing that was going on around that time, Joe, was locally there was a little bit of tension, I'd say, between some people that had a lot of strong environmental concerns about the enterprise of farming. And so we were concerned about that. The district our main task is to promote conservation. And we knew we could do that through some education to let people know what was happening on the farm. And also we wanted to continue to get the voters to support conservation legislation and, of course, financial support.
Sure. Let's talk about those environmental issues for a moment. They're on the minds of a lot of Iowans, and it seems to me one of the proactive things that the Conservation District did was they recognized here in Johnson County there are a lot of folks that would call themselves environmentalists, and really went out to meet them and develop a dialogue. How did that go over?
Well, we really began to develop our sessions to target what we thought were the hot topics. We really wanted to take some of those issues head on. And so we sent out invitations to different environmental groups. We also got involved on the business angle with the Chamber of Commerce so that we could really try to address with the general population, with the leaders of the community, what it is that's going on in modern farming. And we felt that by exchanging information and really people sitting down talking to people, maybe we could dispel some of the myths, give good information, and just answer people's questions.
And how do you feel that's gone over with people in the urban sector?
I think that it's gone really quite well. I think first of all, we've drawn a kind of variety of people to come to our sessions. Our sessions are taped and often played over public access television, so we get a little more exposure in that way. And actually our program was awarded some honors because it was one of the first in the state to really ambitiously go about getting rural people and the urban people to sit down together and face off on some of these issues.
It's been very effective. I have had an opportunity to attend both the sessions in kind of a classroom environment as well as some field sessions. It's very interesting to be able to, and I've found it very interesting to be able to go out on some farms and see the operations in action. Dispels a lot of myths about how you think people do business.
It's really true, Joe. You know, people are pretty much, by this generation that's growing up now, divorced from the agrarian society. I think a lot of people more my age, I grew up on a farm, or people had grandpas or uncles or cousins. Everybody seemed to have a farm to go to. But that's really not the truth anymore. And so there's just something that feels really good about getting back out on a farm. I just, it's always amazing to me to see kind of a change that comes over people when they have a chance to get out and ride the tractor or watch the seeds in the ground or whatever. So it's been, I think, really effective.
Great. I was reading some materials recently, or actually it was an article on the Non-Farmer's Guide, and one of the things that I read was the statement, "We all live in the watershed." What does that mean to urban and rural folks?
Well, I'm kind of a map person, Joe, and there's all different kinds of maps. I think a lot of us go by interstate maps or road maps or those kinds of things. But if you were to imagine a map that just showed the creeks and the waterways and the rivers of our county, you'd see that around each of those streams there's the high point that would define the boundaries of that watershed. And so if we look at a watershed, for example, Clear Creek, that starts out in Iowa County and covers, you know, thousands, probably 35,000 acres, and as most of our urban residents around the Iowa City Coralville area know, it empties out into the Iowa River right over close to downtown Coralville. And when you think about a watershed neighborhood, you're really thinking about all that land that is that boundary, and everything that happens in that land eventually shows up in that creek. The kind of partnership that we can have is that the farmers, we say, are kind of upland. They're the ones that are working the land. The people that are further down the stream are the ones that get the benefit of either something good happening up there or something not so good happening. So we all affect one another, just like your next door neighbor. Their loud parties affects you. So what happens on the land next to you certainly has an impact on the quality of your life or your neighborhood.
Great. You're watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Bolkcom. We're talking about the Non-Farmer's Guide to Agriculture. Our guest is Mary Somerville, who is a District Commissioner in the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District. Mary, this seems to be a lot about clean water and people's concerns about water quality. And this whole idea of a watershed, land use practices, not only farming, but what we do in urban settings, putting chemicals on our lawn or not paying close attention when we change our oil in our car. Those kinds of runoffs that happen affect the water in our rivers and creeks and streams. How does the Non-Farmer's Guide, do you feel, address that question of water quality?
Well, sometimes, you know, farmers like to brag that they're the original environmentalists. And since, you know, about the 1930s, when we first formed soil and water conservation districts, we've promoted a lot of really basic soil conservation practices, things like ways to slow the water down as it travels through the watershed. And you can do that with strategic planning, or the way that you shape the earth. If you're going to disturb the earth, then try to leave behind some kind of a shape that will be able to handle that water. And so I guess when we look at those practices that have been developed with plantings, the way we shape the soil, how we use tillage, all of those kinds of techniques and practices are just as relevant to the backyard. So I don't think there's a farmer in the world that would use any kind of chemicals on his land. Well, I know he can't or she can't unless they've been trained and actually certified to use those chemicals. I think the same would be true of a homeowner, to really carefully read the labels of those things you buy down at your local lawn and garden department, those kinds of things. Looking at the plantings that you put around your yard. certainly as you look, we're working right now with developers in a special urban erosion project. And again, we're trying to get people to think ahead a little bit and do some pre-planning so that when we go in and disturb the soil for the purpose of development or creating a street or putting in infrastructure, that there are some things that you can do ahead of time that would really minimize how much soil loss there would be and how much we would then affect the water supply.
Very good.
We have a lot to learn from each other, Joe.
There's a lot of good education happening through this program, that's for sure. What is the most important message that the farm sector wants the urban sector to understand? Are there a couple messages or a couple pieces of information? Yeah,
I think there are some, and in a sense it kind of surprises me. We had some focus groups after about 2 years into our program. We're now sponsored in part by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture.
Great.
That is, they have a little research base to what they do, and so we had focus groups, and it was kind of interesting what the farmers said that they would really like urban people or small town people to know about them is that they have so much in common with everyone else. They have this family values, they care about the environment, and they really want the same quality of life that anyone else does. They really would like people to understand the operation of farming so that there's some knowledge that goes with why they do what they do with the land in terms of the use of, no-till farming or the use of chemicals in their farming. And they also want people to know that they're concerned about urban sprawl, about land use, because that certainly impacts the value of their land, their taxes, all those kinds of things too. So they just, I think another thing is they would like to see more education about agriculture and farming in the schools, recognizing that there may be still some kids out there that even though they're growing up here in Iowa, still think that somewhere you just turn on a faucet and out comes milk. They're surprised. Kids just don't know where the whole food production cycle is something that they feel they could teach kids about, or that kids certainly growing up here in Iowa should know about. So those are a few of the messages that they send. And when we've seen urban folks and farmers sit down together, it's very amazing how quickly those kind of common ideas, their common feelings and goals really shine through, and the differences start to fade away.
Well, the communication that you mentioned, I think, is really, really critical to addressing some of the ongoing issues on the farm and our interest in Iowa to keep farmers on the farm. And urban folks, and we have urban legislators who write laws in Des Moines, need to be aware of what's going on in rural Iowa and rural America, for that matter, as they try and develop approaches to keeping farming sustainable and economic for folks that are on the land.
Yeah, we really want to. There's one kind of percentage figure that always fascinates me, and that is that 98% of the people are more urban or town or suburban, and there's 2% of the population that are really engaged in farming. And yet, of those 2%, they're really making decisions about the use of 98% of the land. I mean, agriculture in Iowa is the thing that's happening out there, and when you see conservation farmers making wise decisions about the land, then we all benefit from that. And so it's kind of that 98% that are kind of making decisions or voting or electing officials to represent them. We hope that they're aware of the great contribution that wise, stewardship-minded farmers are making out there.
Well, we all benefit by having people on the land and doing good conservation practices. Though, you know, in Iowa City in particular, we get our water from the Iowa River. Des Moines gets their water from the river. The Quad Cities and others, that we all share in the need for clean water, both on the farm and in urban settings. And folks living in urban settings have a role to play too. I think that's been a kind of a one-sided conversation over the last few years, as farmers in Iowa have kind of been beat up quite a bit for concern about agriculture, or chemicals in agriculture, concern about too many fertilizers and the like, and those things ending up in our water. But I think we have a shared responsibility in that regard. Were there any things that you've learned through this program that surprised you over the last few years? Anything that jumps out?
Well, Well, I guess I've always had a great appreciation of nature, the land, the water, the critters out there. I guess the thing that's probably impressed me the most is when the sessions that we've done on the soil structure, and to really start to kind of dig down just a little bit and to just look at the life that's below the surface in a real healthy soil that has good structure, the worms and all the little creatures that really are contributing to the health of that soil. And that's just one of the sessions that every time I go, I'm just kind of enraptured by what happens when you really work along with nature. So I guess there's a whole subterranean class of wildlife that I've grown to appreciate a whole lot since I've been involved in this
That's great.
program.
Well, you've put in a lot of time on it. I know that from seeing you at meetings, and it's great to have your leadership here in Johnson County. We're going to promote in a moment how people can get in touch with the Soil and Water Conservation District here in Johnson County to learn more about the Non-Farmer's Guide to Agriculture. It's been a real success here in Johnson County and something that we think others can use across the state. Mary, our time's run out. I'd like to thank you for being here. We've really appreciated it. Check it out, the Non-Farmer's Guide to Agriculture. We'll give you some information about it, how urban and rural folks can get together and talk about our shared interest in having clean environment and economic farming going on in our state. You've been watching Iowa News and Views. This is show number 9. I'd like to take a moment to thank Greg Dickinson from Clinton, Iowa, for our new logo on the set tonight. If you're a regular watcher, you've seen the logo. It's a picture of Iowa with the news and views, and that's what we're all about here. We did a little news tonight, and we're doing a little views. I'd like to thank Greg. We appreciate his work on that logo. Also like to thank our sponsors from around the state that make the show possible in the various communities in which it airs. I'd like to thank our contributors for their support, and I'd sure like to thank our crew. Our crew is an all-volunteer crew. We've got Doug on the board in the back, and Nathan and Chris working on that. In the studio here, we've got Derek and Linda, and Steve has been helping out as well. We've got quite a crew that's been putting this show out on a regular basis, and we will continue to do that. So be sure you tune in. Got 30 seconds here. I want you to check out our webpage. We'll give you that address here shortly. We've got some things on it that we think you'll enjoy learning about the show. We'd like to have some ideas for future guests and future topics, so feel free to send those in. You've been watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Bolkcom, and I want you to remember this is just a TV program you're watching here. What's important is what you're doing each and every day in your community. See you next time.